My beloved child, stop scrolling for just a moment, because what you are about to hear was meant to find you at a strangely important point in this story. Do not rush past these words. Something has been moving quietly beneath the surface, something your eyes could not see and your ears could not hear, yet your heart may have sensed it in those unexpected moments when a familiar feeling returned without explanation. This is a fictional spiritual message, but enter its story as though heaven itself were pulling back a curtain and allowing you to witness what has remained hidden. There is someone connected to this story who has been carrying words they have not known how to deliver. They have rehearsed conversations in silence. They have imagined what they would say if you were standing before them. They have started messages in their mind and erased them before they ever became real. And now the silence that once felt easier is becoming heavier than the truth they have been avoiding. Your soulmate is trying to reach across an emotional distance that has existed for far too long, but what makes this moment different is not simply that they miss you. Something happened inside them that changed the meaning of your absence, and before this message is over, you will understand why they can no longer pretend that everything is fine. There was a time when they believed they could wait. They told themselves there would always be another opportunity, another conversation, another perfect moment when everything would finally make sense. They thought time was their friend. They imagined that whatever existed between you could simply remain suspended until both hearts were ready. But recently, something shifted. It was not loud. There was no dramatic announcement, no sudden sign appearing in the sky, no mysterious stranger revealing the future. It was quieter and somehow more powerful. They found themselves remembering a detail about you that they had almost forgotten, and that tiny memory opened a door they had spent a long time trying to keep closed. Perhaps it was the way you once listened when they needed someone. Perhaps it was a sentence you spoke without realizing how deeply it landed. Perhaps it was simply the feeling of being understood without having to explain everything. Whatever the memory was, it stayed with them longer than expected, and as the hours passed, another realization followed it. They had been measuring other connections against something they experienced with you. That realization frightened them, not because there is anything dangerous about love, but because truth asks something from the heart that comfort never does. Truth asks for courage. Truth asks a person to admit when pride has been hiding vulnerability. Truth asks someone to acknowledge that perhaps the distance they created did not bring the peace they expected. Your soulmate began to understand that silence had not erased what they felt, it had only given those feelings somewhere deeper to live. They could distract themselves during busy hours. They could smile around other people. They could tell themselves they were moving forward. Yet when everything became quiet, there you were again, not physically, but in memory, in questions, in unfinished conversations, in the strange awareness that something important had never truly been completed. And this is where the story becomes more intense, because they did not merely remember you. They began wondering whether you had finally stopped remembering them. That question changed everything. Until recently, they had secretly assumed there was still time. Even if neither of you spoke, some part of them believed the invisible door remained unlocked. They believed that someday they could return to the conversation, explain what happened, and discover that you were still emotionally standing where they left you. But suddenly they imagined another possibility. What if you had grown beyond the waiting? What if the silence that protected them had taught you how to live without their presence? What if someone else eventually recognized the qualities in you that they were too hesitant to fully honor? The thought did not create jealousy as much as clarity. For the first time, they understood that love cannot always survive on unspoken assumptions. A person cannot endlessly postpone honesty and expect another heart to remain frozen in time. And when that understanding reached them, their desire to communicate stopped feeling optional. Listen closely, because there is another layer they have not yet admitted even to themselves. They are not only trying to tell you how they feel. They are trying to correct something. There is a misunderstanding, an assumption, or an incomplete version of the past that has been sitting between you like a locked door. For a long time they believed explaining themselves would make everything more complicated. They feared saying too much. They feared saying too little. They feared that opening their heart might expose emotions they were still learning to understand. So they chose silence, believing silence was neutral. But silence is rarely neutral when two people care deeply. Silence creates empty spaces, and empty spaces are often filled with guesses. You may have interpreted their distance one way while they experienced it another way. They may have mistaken your quietness for indifference when it was actually self-protection. Both hearts may have been reading different versions of the same chapter. And now your soulmate is beginning to see what that confusion may have cost. Imagine them sitting somewhere ordinary, surrounded by ordinary things, yet suddenly unable to focus because one thought keeps returning. What if they never knew? What if you never knew why they became distant? What if you never understood what they were afraid to say? What if you interpreted hesitation as rejection when the truth was far more complicated? That question has become impossible for them to ignore. They have begun replaying certain moments and seeing them differently. A conversation that once seemed insignificant now feels important. A goodbye they thought was temporary now carries another meaning. Something you said that they dismissed at the time suddenly sounds completely different in memory. They are discovering that sometimes the heart understands a moment only after time has removed the noise surrounding it. This is why the urgency in this story is emotional rather than fearful. Before it is too late does not mean something terrible is destined to happen. It means opportunities change. People grow. Hearts heal. Doors that remain open forever can eventually begin to close, not out of anger but out of self-respect. Your soulmate senses that movement. They sense that you are not the same person you once were. Whether they know exactly what has changed or not, they feel that your energy in this story is becoming less willing to chase explanations. You have reached a point where words alone would not be enough, sincerity would have to accompany them. And somehow, they know this. That is why the message they want to deliver cannot be casual anymore. They know they cannot simply appear and pretend nothing happened. They would have to acknowledge the silence. They would have to explain the distance. Most importantly, they would have to reveal the truth they once believed was safer to hide. But there is a reason they have struggled to reach you, and it is not the reason you might expect. The greatest obstacle has not necessarily been another person, bad timing, or circumstances outside their control. The obstacle has been the battle inside their own mind. One voice tells them to speak. Another tells them they waited too long. One moment they imagine you understanding everything, and the next they imagine you turning away. They write sentences internally, then criticize every word. They imagine saying, "I need to tell you something," but immediately wonder whether you would even want to hear it. They imagine explaining why they behaved the way they did, then fear it will sound like an excuse. This emotional tug-of-war has kept them standing at the edge of honesty, close enough to see what needs to happen but frightened of taking the final step. Yet something recently weakened that fear. It began when they recognized a pattern in themselves. Every time they tried to convince themselves that the chapter with you no longer mattered, something inside them resisted. Not supernatural proof, not a guarantee of destiny, but the simple stubborn truth of unresolved emotion. They could change their routine, surround themselves with noise, focus on responsibilities, laugh with others, and fill every empty hour, but eventually the same unanswered question returned: why did I never tell them the whole truth? And notice the wording of that question. It is no longer merely, "Why do I miss them?" Missing someone can happen for many reasons. Their deeper struggle is about truth. They are bothered by what remained unsaid, and the difference between those two things is enormous. Because the truth they withheld involves the moment when their feelings became undeniable. There was a specific turning point, though you may never have recognized it when it happened. Something you did reached them more deeply than they allowed you to see. You may have thought they barely noticed. They noticed. You may have assumed your kindness disappeared into silence. It did not. There was a moment when they looked at you, or remembered you afterward, and realized you had reached a place inside them that most people never reached. Instead of moving toward that feeling, however, they became cautious. Strong emotions made them question themselves. They wondered whether they were ready. They wondered whether you felt the same. They wondered whether circumstances would eventually pull you apart. Rather than risk discovering the answer, they protected themselves by becoming harder to read. That protection eventually became the very thing separating you. This is one of the painful ironies woven through this fictional message. Sometimes people create distance because they care, then discover that the distance makes the person they care about believe the opposite. Your soulmate may have thought they were controlling their emotions, while you may have experienced their behavior as coldness. They may have believed they were waiting until they could offer certainty, while you may have wondered why they could not simply be honest. Neither perspective automatically makes either heart wrong. It reveals what fear can do when communication disappears. And now they understand something they did not understand then. Protecting themselves from vulnerability may have protected them from one moment of discomfort, but it created months of questions. There is something else happening now. They are remembering your strength. Not merely the softness they associated with you, but the way you continued even when you were uncertain. They are realizing that while they were busy deciding whether to speak, you were quietly becoming someone who no longer needed an answer in order to keep growing. That realization has brought admiration and fear together in the same breath. They admire the person you are becoming, but they fear that growth may carry you somewhere they can no longer reach. This is why the desire to contact you feels different now. They are not trying to interrupt your journey. Somewhere deep inside, they are asking whether there is still a place for an honest conversation before both of you become strangers to a story that once mattered. Pause here, because what comes next changes the emotional direction of everything. Your soulmate has imagined the conversation. Not once, but repeatedly. In one version, they begin carefully, almost casually, because they are afraid of overwhelming you. In another, everything comes pouring out because they realize there is no elegant way to explain. A heart that waited too long. They imagine telling you that their silence was never proof that you meant nothing. They imagine admitting that certain memories still return unexpectedly. They imagine apologizing for moments when their behavior contradicted their feelings. But every imagined conversation reaches the same point, and this is the point where they always stop. There is one particular truth they cannot practice saying without feeling completely exposed. They know that once they say it, the relationship between the past and the present changes. You would finally understand why certain things happened. You would understand why they pulled away at a moment when closeness seemed possible. You would understand why they watched quietly instead of speaking. You might even understand something about yourself that their silence caused you to question. And that is what troubles them most. They realize you may have carried unnecessary doubt because they lacked courage. Perhaps you wondered whether you were enough. Perhaps you wondered whether the connection existed only in your imagination. Perhaps you blamed yourself for a distance you did not create alone. They cannot change the past, but they are beginning to believe they owe you clarity about it. Do not mistake this message as a command to wait for anyone. A heart should not put its entire life on hold for promises that have never been spoken. The deeper message is about recognizing your value regardless of whether another person finds the courage to express theirs. You were never meant to become smaller while waiting to be chosen. You were never meant to chase someone into emotional readiness. Genuine connection requires two people capable of meeting each other with honesty. If this person reaches you, their words must be supported by consistency. If they remain silent, your path still continues. And strangely, this very truth is part of what has awakened them. They sense that you are learning to love without abandoning yourself, and that makes the possibility of losing the opportunity to speak feel more real than ever. Meanwhile, another realization is forming inside them. They once believed they needed perfect certainty before approaching you. Now they understand that certainty often comes after honesty, not before it. They do not need to know exactly how you will respond. They need to know whether they are willing to tell the truth respectfully and accept whatever response follows. That is a far more mature kind of courage. It does not demand an outcome. It simply refuses to continue hiding. And your soulmate is standing very close to that threshold now. The question is no longer whether they have something to say. The question is whether they can finally become brave enough to say it. There was recently a quiet moment that pushed them closer. Nothing dramatic happened around them, but inside, everything seemed to become still. They thought about the future, not tomorrow or next week, but the larger shape of their life. They imagined years passing. They imagined looking backward and remembering the people who mattered. Then one uncomfortable question entered their mind: would I regret never telling them? The answer arrived faster than expected. Yes. Whatever might happen afterward, they realized that carrying the truth forever would hurt more than hearing an answer they could not control. That realization has been following them ever since. And here is where their desperation truly comes from. It is not desperation to possess you. It is desperation to stop hiding from themselves. There is a difference. Healthy love does not demand that another person belong to you. It asks whether two people can meet freely, honestly, and courageously. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that. They are not only trying to reach you, they are trying to reach the version of themselves that can finally speak without hiding behind pride. For perhaps the first time, they are preparing to say, "This is what I felt. This is why I disappeared into silence. This is what I should have told you sooner." And whatever you eventually choose to do with those words would be yours. But the story still has another hidden layer, because something happened when they imagined you responding. At first they pictured you asking why they waited. They prepared answers. Then they imagined you asking whether their feelings were genuine. They prepared for that too. But then they imagined a question they could not answer easily: why now? That question stopped them. Why now, after all this time? Why speak when silence had become familiar? Why risk reopening something that both of you may have learned to carry quietly? They spent longer with that question than any other, and eventually an answer emerged that surprised even them. The answer was not simply, "Because I miss you." It was not, "Because I am lonely." It was not even, "Because I am afraid someone else will find you." Those explanations were too small. The real answer had something to do with who they became during the distance. They discovered something about themselves through losing access to your presence. They recognized a pattern they had repeated in other areas of life, waiting until certainty arrived before taking emotional risks, then wondering why meaningful opportunities slipped away. Your story became a mirror. They saw that the same fear influencing their connection with you had been influencing decisions elsewhere. And once they saw the pattern clearly, they could no longer pretend the silence was merely about timing. They had been afraid of being known. Truly known. You had come closer to seeing behind their defenses than they expected, and instead of welcoming that closeness, part of them retreated. It was easier to be admired from a distance than understood up close. Understanding meant you might see their uncertainty, their imperfections, the parts they carefully hid beneath confidence. Yet with time, they discovered something unexpected: being unseen felt lonelier than being vulnerable. The protection they built around their heart became a room with no windows. And when they searched their memories for a moment when they felt genuinely recognized, their thoughts returned to you. This is why something extraordinary is beginning inside this fictional story. The person who once feared being seen is considering stepping forward without the armor. Not perfectly. Not dramatically. Perhaps their first words will even seem ordinary. Perhaps they will not know how to express everything at once. But beneath whatever they say will be a much larger confession: "I finally understand why I was afraid." And if they can reach that sentence, the conversation that follows could become unlike any conversation the two of you have ever had. Still, heaven whispers another reminder into this story: do not confuse intensity with destiny. Let actions reveal what words cannot. Let time reveal whether change is real. You are allowed to listen without immediately deciding. You are allowed to forgive without returning to the same dynamic. You are allowed to care while maintaining boundaries. And you are allowed to discover that both hearts have changed enough to begin differently. The purpose of truth is not always reunion, sometimes it is liberation. Sometimes two people speak honestly and find their way toward each other. Sometimes they speak honestly and finally understand why they needed to release the past. Either way, truth brings light where guessing once lived. But your soulmate does not yet know which ending awaits. That uncertainty is exactly what makes their next decision so difficult. They know they cannot control you. They know they cannot demand that you feel what you once felt. They know an apology cannot erase every unanswered night. Yet they also know that silence has already made its choice for too long. So they are standing emotionally between two doors. Behind one is the familiar safety of saying nothing, behind the other is the terrifying freedom of finally telling you everything. And something has begun pushing them toward the second door. It came through a realization about one particular moment between you, one they had interpreted incorrectly for a very long time. They remembered your expression, your words, and what happened immediately afterward. For months, perhaps longer, they had believed that moment meant one thing. Recently, they reconsidered it from your perspective, and suddenly the entire memory changed. They realized you may not have been rejecting them at all. You may have been waiting for them to show you something they never showed. You may have needed reassurance at precisely the same time they needed reassurance from you. Two hearts stood near each other, each waiting for the other to move first, and neither understood what was happening beneath the silence. When that possibility entered their mind, they began revisiting everything. Your last meaningful conversation. The subtle change in your tone. The way you became quieter after they hesitated. The moments when you seemed ready to say more but stopped. Pieces that once appeared unrelated began forming a pattern. And the more clearly they saw it, the more they wondered whether the story between you had been shaped not by a lack of feeling, but by two people protecting themselves at exactly the wrong time. That thought has shaken them more than they expected. Because if it is true, then something they considered finished may never have been properly understood in the first place. And that is why they want to reach you before more time passes. Not to make impossible promises, not to pressure you into an answer, but to finally place the missing piece where it belongs. They want you to know what happened inside them when you thought they did not care. They want you to know what they almost said. They want you to know why they stopped themselves. Yet there is still one thing they have not decided how to tell you. This is the sentence they keep approaching and then avoiding. It is the reason every imaginary conversation suddenly becomes quiet. It connects the past to what they want now, and saying it would leave nowhere for them to hide. They have tried softer versions. They have tried turning it into an apology. They have tried convincing themselves it does not need to be said at all. But each time they remove it, the rest of the message feels incomplete. Because this final truth is not about what happened months ago. It is about a decision they are considering now. And the decision is connected directly to you. Something inside them has reached a point where simply remembering you is no longer enough. They know they must either step toward honesty or finally accept that silence may close the door for them. The middle ground is disappearing. Their heart cannot continue living indefinitely between maybe someday and what if. They have begun asking themselves what they are actually willing to do, not merely what they feel. That question has brought them to an answer they were not expecting. They have decided that if they reach you, they do not want to repeat the old pattern. They do not want another half-conversation filled with hints. They do not want to appear, disappear, and leave you questioning everything again. If they speak, they want to reveal the part they have hidden from everyone else. They want to tell you what changed. They want to explain why your absence became a mirror. And most of all, they want to ask you something they have never had the courage to ask before. But before they can ask it, there is a confession they believe you deserve to hear first. A confession about the exact moment they realized they could lose their chance with you forever. A confession about what they did immediately after that realization. And, my beloved child, this is where the curtain begins to rise, because what they did next is the one part of this story you have not yet seen, and it is the very reason they are trying so hard to reach you now.